So without further ado, I'd like to jump right into it. Ask Dr. Austin once again to come to the stage, and we're going to focus on the report out for the Alliances and Community of Practice session. So Jamie, I'm not sure who's joining you, but hopefully everybody's on their way.
You have a mic on yourself.
Thank you.
Let me add my welcome to Alan's. The storms missed us. See, the gods are in favor. The storms came through after everybody had a good time, so it's all good. We also keep your heads up because we mix and match the leads. They're never exactly the same. So we do that on purpose to see if you're snoozing in the back of the room. And we come to the most interesting, in my opinion, of the three breakout, the discussions we had yesterday afternoon on what we've termed alliances and a community or communities of practice. And we'll get into what those terms mean, but the routine will be the same. I'm going to have each of our breakout co-leads give us a couple of minutes, and then we'll get into some discussion about synergies, overlaps in their discussions, and then we'll open it up as we have for Q&A, both from you people and from our virtual attendees. So.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sudai Thananius James. We were in Group A. My co-lead was Alan. And are we just telling you some of the things that came out, I'm assuming? So one of the main things I think that came to light, this was brought up by one of our participants, was the fact that if you're looking at the intentionality of including Indigenous groups, but not just Indigenous groups, other underserved or not served groups that can be pretty wide range, it's just that instead of just talking about it, we put it as a best practice and just do it. And so I think that was the overall arching what it's like. We just need to do some of these things instead of just talking about them. And then what that looks like is really looking at different examples and models that have already been done, and then using those as a start off point. And that doesn't mean that you can necessarily use that exact sample the exact same way, but that you can use that to see how you can adapt it to the particular communities, the different cultures, the different needs of whoever you're working with, so that you can actually have success in that. And that also means that it may not always go the way you want to, but really navigating through those challenges so that you can really develop the best practices for your community that builds the trust, and then that continuing relationship. And I think that was another thing that came out, was the consistency. So at the beginning, during, and then after, what are the forethought of that from the beginning, and then looking at long-term, how do you sustain those relationships so that you can have continuity in your programming, and then also, depending on what the requirements are, but also the expectations from all sides. I don't know if that encompasses that.
Awesome. I'm Allison from Schmidt-Ocean Institute, and I co-led Breakout Group D. And we started talking about, we kind of brought it back to basics and talked about what are the barriers to sharing data even in the first place. And things that came out were antiquated technology, incentives for sharing data, formats, and missing standards. And there's no clear repository or archive where some of the data should be held. We also talked about the importance of, when you're beginning to collect data, kind of knowing your customer. And for industry, sometimes they really do have a customer, and in other scenarios, the customer is the national marine sanctuaries or the climate scientists or local communities that need that data. But really understanding if they can even use the data. Sometimes we go out and we're like, everyone will want my data because it's so awesome, and I love my data, so everyone else wants it. But what do they really need out of that data, and is it what you have collected? So that was a really great conversation. And we also talked about how to use data to enable discovery. And so the example was given of kind of a virtual reality setting where you can walk through an immersive experience and find shipwrecks and kind of discover on your own. So you're enabling discovery with the data, and also sharing more about the discoveries that we as a community make with the data, and not maybe focusing so much on the data itself, but what we have discovered with that data. And then we did, excuse me, we did turn our conversation to how do we connect this data collection activities with the local communities that we need to work with. And we talked about when we're writing a proposal, that's really when the relationship and alliance needs to begin. And we so often write data management plans or an outreach plan that is an empty promise, and we need to be better about incorporating communication and outreach and our intentions into those plans, and then actually following through. But the question was, who holds what we put into writing? Who holds that accountability? Is it the funder that's assessing the proposal in the first place and granting the money, or is it somewhere else, the communities or the science? So I think I'll stop there for now, but it was a great conversation.
Great.
Hi, I'm Jill Burke. I'm with the U.S. Geological Survey, and I was a co-leader on Group B. Many of the themes you both have already talked about, we also talked about as well. We talked quite a bit about data and data access and how different stakeholders can get to the data. And with the high variety of data in the ocean exploration community, we talked about how probably curation by separate groups, but really having a place to find all the data, and discoverability is key. But then also having technology and tools available to interpret that data for the various stakeholders and partners to get the products that they need, the information they need out of this data, which was kind of seen as a bit lacking at the moment. And we also turned our attention to also including that human element in the data. So there's a lot of qualitative data in the historical setting that we don't have a way to incorporate well into a lot of our data sets and data archives that we kind of need to work on better. But then as a community, what do we need in terms of to get a lot of this data that's out there that does still need to be archived, because it is resources and will take from possibly other things, but what is the importance of getting that into the collective data that's available to everyone? And we also turned our attention to, again, the intentionality of the outreach and communication with the people that our projects are affecting, as well as our partners themselves, and that there are entities out there that already know how to connect with a lot of these communities and partners, and to not always, we don't always have to reinvent the wheel, as we keep saying, but to partner with them so we can get the actual individual partners we need into the projects again at the beginning, and plan for what we're doing. A lot of the same things.
Good. All right, so I'm Jill Zandy with Mate Inspiration for Innovation and the Global Mate ROV competition, and my co-lead is Millie Pitts. We're Group E, and we had a really interesting, I think, exciting discussion, and kind of taking from the panel that spoke yesterday that talked about we need to do something now. What can we do now? Not 5 years, not 10 years, but now. And I am excited to say that we came up with an actionable idea that is attainable this year. And so trying to, before I share that, right, building up the excitement here.
This woman is setting herself up right now. So.
Yeah, I got an assignment. Just to kind of frame out and share with you where our discussion started. So we talked about communities of practice and really defining that. And one of our participants said, well, is a community of practice about technology or platforms? And I think that a number of us in the room said, no, it's really about people. And I'm going to put Jamie on the spot real quick, because he offered up a definition of communities of practice, which I think was a really well articulated definition. If you would share that.
Well, Alex Idelson, who our Octonaut maestro, was sitting in our Group E discussion, and he said, look, it's a nice phrase, community of practice, but I need to be able to go home. And he mentioned his wife, and I don't know what their relationship is like, but I said, okay, I'll offer something. I said it's a diverse, open group, people that takes in hand a set of tasks, funnels that tasks through some methodologies that are predictable but revisable to a set of common goals and objectives. Now, all of us have a sense of what community is. You know, I was at a drilling meeting 35 years ago, and one of our luminaries got up and said, "We keep talking about the community all the time." And he looked around the room and he said, "We're the community." It was a much smaller group than this. Well, we are the community, but we are constantly wanting to reach out. And so I think that's where I was coming from. I'm going to get back to all of you on your definition of community of practice. So be thinking about it. You're ducking it a little, but we're going to get it, because I think one of the important outcomes of this meeting and the report will be a definition that we can buy into. It's a little bit like what NOMEC's been doing with defining OE. There is no such thing as a single definition of OE. But if we could get a consensus, and I use the word consensus in my definition of community of practice as well. We'll never all agree. Especially you'll never all agree with me. But consensus can be achieved. And I think that's something we should strive for. So Jill,
Okay, well, thank you. Yeah, so I thought that was wonderful. And yes, Adam, thank you for asking that question. Again, we talked a lot about the definition. We also had a participant from the space exploration community, Roman, who's out there. And it was interesting. He said, you know, I wrote in and asked if I could participate in this meeting. You know, I understand space and the time with ocean and the time with climate. And he's got some philanthropic, I could even say that word today, funders who are interested in trying to communicate to them and tie in the messaging, right? How all those things are related, but I need help. And I think I appreciated what you said about climate is sexy right now. It's a hot topic. So how to bring that messaging, how to bring those three elements together, space, ocean, and climate, and put a message together and get it out beyond this community of practice.
Roman made us uncomfortable.
It was good. Oh no, we had a very lively discussion. It was really, thank you, Roman, for that. But you know, we several of us again agreed with all that Roman said. And while we didn't necessarily have an immediate answer to the messaging and how to do this, the idea that we came up with, the actionable idea that again is attainable this year, is something that I think will allow us to continue to work on framing that message and getting it out beyond this community of practice. And so, again, I'm setting this up here, but I came to learn today just a little background about how we came around to this idea. Drew shared with me today that it actually originated early on, right, in pre-meeting discussions and kind of percolated through lunch and then showed up in our meeting where Mashkor and Casey from NOAA OE were talking about the community of practice and how they come together, what motivates a community of practice to come together. And the example was thrown out there of UNOLS, Dennis, and what motivated UNOLS to come together. And a lot of it was the standardization, the being efficient, being effective. And Mashkor and Casey specifically mentioned, you know what, we're going to try to bring together a community of practice to talk about, I think it was connectors, correct me if I'm wrong, Mashkor, I think it was connectors. And we want to do this at the upcoming Oceans Conference. We're going to bring the community together. Mashkor also mentioned his membership in the Hydrographic Society of America. And that's when, for me anyway, there was the big aha, the big duh moment and the power of professional societies. You know, I've been a card-carrying member of the Marine Technology Society now for over 20 years. And I think you heard my story on Monday. It really helped shape my career and really establish the program that I run, and has become my passion and my life's work. And I thought, how, you know, we could use MTS as a vehicle to continue the conversations beyond this forum, beyond this event, and bring it out to a wider community of practice, if you will, extend our community of practice. And we could use the venue of Oceans as a way to, again, continue the conversations and to bring together these communities of practice. And it doesn't have to be MTS, but like I said, it's a professional society that I've been involved with forever. And the president-elect just happened to be here and I was getting together with him for dinner. So I said, well, let me bring this to Justin Manley and see what he thinks about this idea of developing and he gave a thumbs up, right? Even though a lot of people had seen him before I got to him and kind of forewarned him that I would be talking to him. And he, I think maybe made him a little nervous, although I never think Justin gets nervous. But anyway, listen to the idea about partnering with MTS. MTS has an ocean exploration committee. It needs a little reinvigoration. There's the upcoming Oceans Conference that partners with, it's MTS and IEEE OES. It's being held at Hampton Roads in late October. That's again, a vehicle and a venue to continue these conversations, to continue to bring people together. We're still going to get together in these forums, right? We know we need to do them. It's mandated every so many years, but this is a way, it's already established event and venue to continue the conversations on a yearly basis. That conference is annual. So I think that was the biggest, most exciting thing for me anyway, that came out of that. It brought a lot of things together. And so it was interesting how it started off as an idea early on and kind of percolated through. And then it I think, culminated in our discussion and this actionable item, again, that's
And it wasn't
achievable
only
this year.
actionable.
Well,
Someone will take action.
Right. We talked about, right, in our discussions, and I know Millie and I did, about accountability and responsibility and who owns it. And so I will own that in partnership with my colleague Justin at MTS, because
Well, thank you very much. I will be
Yes.
getting back to all of you on this community of practice issue,
Yes.
but Simone, I have not forgotten about you. Please.
Thanks. Sorry. Yes, Simone.
Hi, everybody. Again, Simone Barkley, and I was in Group C, and we talked a lot about who is present at this forum and who isn't present, and how we can work to set up community of practices and alliances to get the folks who aren't here to be participating. And so a couple of things that we called out, and also Joe, I'm pretty excited too, because we got some actual items, maybe not today, but we got some really good things to start working on. So we talked a lot about about pay inequities and transparency, and how that is really critical, we think, to changing the landscape of the ocean work and ocean exploration too, and using that as a mechanism to really help people to know that this is an opportunity that they will want to participate in, that they will want to devote their time to as well. So as simple as, you know, at one level, right, like putting the salary on a job posting, right, like that is really valuable. Folks spend their time when they are applying, and I think that really helps people to know what they're getting into, and making sure that the pay is fair, get pay equity, right? Where are folks living, making sure that they are being paid a livable wage. We also talked a lot about an intentional mentoring program. And this idea came up because we saw that we're looking kind of for an onboarding ramp for youngsters, for scientists who want to come into ocean exploration, but maybe don't have as much guidance, and or folks who have participated in some undergraduate classes or internships, right? But what happens after those internships? What happens after you graduate from college? What happens? How do we make sure that they actually get a job? Because we definitely have seen a disconnect there. And we talked, I mean, I gave the example of me and and how I was a student who was supported by NOAA, undergraduate, graduate level, post-grad as a Canals Fellow, and I still didn't get a job at NOAA. And so how do we change that? How do we change the landscape of students being supported, which is really great. Like they were paid opportunities, right? So that those are the things that we've been saying that we need. We need students to be paid, right? We need all of these all these efforts to be made, but sometimes those aren't even enough, right? And we also talked a little bit about, you know, partnering with MSIs or HBCUs and targeting groups that way. And again, those things have been done. And sometimes that still isn't enough, because I attended 2 HBCUs. And when I went to graduate school, I had an advisor that really didn't support me and didn't know how to work with me. And I was the only Black person in my lab. And it pushed me out. I don't do research anymore. I don't do shock research anymore. And part of that is attributed to what I experienced in grad school. And so all of these things led us to talking about how do we prepare advisors to know how to support, like genuinely support and create a safe space for their students of all backgrounds, so that we can then create a space where not only is everyone invited, but that they feel safe while here, that they feel safe, that they can say how they feel, that their ideas are going to be respected, that all of these things that I think we really struggle with. So the intentional mentoring program, I think, was a really huge deal. And we were all really excited about it. And going back to, speaking with local groups or letting the folks who know how to do the work that maybe we don't know how to do, or that maybe some folks in the community don't know how to do. If we are going to, for example, have the mentors be trained, maybe we do at the local level work with, or regional level, right? Work with the groups who do know how to train folks on engaging with folks of all different groups. And then after the mentors have been trained, then we move on to the mentors working with the students. So I'm not saying that it's going to be overnight, but I'm also not saying that we have to wait forever to do this. We can start this process now. And I think that's also really important to say that some things, the end product may take a little bit of time for us to finally get there. However, we can take steps on each level, right? Starting today. So really excited about those two things that we discussed.
I will say times are changing. The Jackson School has just over a painful path put a code of conduct in place on faculty-student relationships. I've been there a long time, and this is a learning process for all. So it's a good thing that it's happening, but you said it's going to take a while, and it's going to take a while.
Jamie, can I say one more thing? Because I wanted to also say that I forgot to share this up, the third thing that we talked about, but that just led me there. So we talked also about kind of like a community engagement or like a resume about how you work with people. So like, yes, you have your resume that says like the work that you do, the research that you do, your academic resume, sure, all of those things. But what about holding folks accountable to how they interact with one another? So when you're talking about a code of conduct, right? And in the example that we gave and we discussed a little bit was when I worked at the National Aquarium, and at the National Aquarium, they when you do your review, they measured you, on your typical like goals, right? Whatever goals you have for your job. But also they have these set of values, and the values are like service, excellence, engagement, a couple innovation. And you were also meant to talk a little bit about how you displayed each of those values and how you showed up and what people noticed about you when you displayed those values. So thinking about a code of conduct and how people work together, I think that that's also extremely important, so that we know that that folks are interacting and being their best selves, right? I think that that's really good.
That's great. I'm going to transition a bit to the piece that's about synergies and overlaps. I heard transparency, I heard data, I heard transitions to other community data. Clearly is the basis for all that we're trying to do, but we now all recognize that we've got to do more. But before we start that, I'm going to go down the line, and I'm going to offer each of you the opportunity to define community of practice. Don't argue for who is number one.
Guess I can go reading yeah, I have to admit this was a new phrase for me when I was reading the white paper, so I had to sit and think about it. But I kind of broke it down. What is a community and what's the practice? So I would say a community of practice is just a group of people that come together to work through standard methodologies, agreed upon processes to reach a common goal.
I like it because it's a lot like mine. Anyone?
Yeah.
I would probably go with something similar. So yeah, a group of people, all the people who want not just the people who are going to get to the end goal, but the people who are involved in the middle steps as well. They also need to be involved in this community of practice to make sure all the different voices are being heard when determining on these, codes of conducts, the standards, but bringing that together. I think it's a broader group than I think lots of times people think of.
Yeah, I would agree. I think you very articulate, and I appreciated, Adam, when you asked about is it the technology, and no, it is the people who use the technology and all the processes and the data gathering and all of that to work towards a common goal. And maybe that's defined a little bit differently, but I also appreciate your comment about the stakeholders. It's all of us, right? It's really thinking creatively about not just the people in this room, but everybody else who might be a stakeholder in this, including the general public, which we have, putting quotes around that because that's a big word.
Yeah. Sorry.
I was still trying to think, but if you're looking at community to me, when I define it, it's really a connection, and it's like interwoven. So knowing that anything that we do like affects somebody else. So having that awareness that what I say, what I do, what I build, what I create is going to be part of everything. I was trying to conceptualize that. Because what it meant necessarily to me and in the communities that I work with, communities of practice that I've worked with, because if you look at definition of community of practice, it's talking about people who are oriented towards the task. So if we use this particular one, we can say that maybe a unifying thing for us is looking at the value of the ocean. But when I say value, my definition of value is going to be very different. And we've seen that already in the past 3 days of what that means. So how do we get together in a group that is a community, a diverse community? And then how do we work together to that? Because I know Hoke and I were talking about, yes, we have a lot of differences, but we also have very strong things that unite us. And that will help us to navigate through those differences, because it's the differences that are going to be the innovative parts of what we do. But in that community of practice, again, we have to look at who's in that community and who is guiding that community. Because if it's the same people that are guiding and setting up the tasks, then just like in a classroom, right? If you're the teacher, you set up the task. Depending on what you want to get out of the students, because we've learned this, you ask a very specific question or you set up a very specific practice. Okay, if you want to give them room for innovation and creation, that looks very different. So whoever is setting the tone for any of community of practice, you have to understand, is that really encompassing of what we want to do within that practice? So it's a little bit more in depth, but I think that's what I got in 5 minutes.
Simone?
I mean, as the last person, right? What else can I really give, right? No, I absolutely agree that it is critical to think about who is included in the community and absolutely who is guiding the community. I really like, I like how we just talked a little bit about our definitions may be different. And so I think that's why it's really critical that even when we discuss the community of practice, that we go back to, Jamie, what you talked about, and knowing that it may have to change, right? It doesn't necessarily have to stay the same and be rigid. And I think keeping things the same has led us to be where we are, right? So being able to change and morph as new people come into the community, as new voices are being heard, as time moves on, as new technology is introduced. I think that those things are also pretty important.
I belong to a community on an island off the East Coast, and we call ourselves a community. We're tied by resources because we've got to maintain our own road. And so I'm going to get at the resource question in a second. But the other thing is that we're welcoming. So we are always happy when somebody joins our number. We get to learn about them. We don't have a written code of conduct, but we have discussed a lot about how to treat each other. And so I really like this idea that we're going to be diverse, but we've got to be open. And as we move forward, because this is going to take years to do well, we've got to keep the portals open and be welcoming and speak each other's language. Okay, now I'm going to ask a related question and then we'll get to Q&A. What are the sticking points going to be? You know, because this is a kind of a kumbaya philosophy, right? Welcome everybody, have a good time, and it will all move forward. But we all know it's not quite that simple. So who wants to take a crack at the sticking points and how we might deal with that?
I'll go first. Resources. I mean, how we determine how we're going to distribute the resources for all the stakeholders involved, and who's going to decide on the prioritization of the goals. I mean, to again distribute those resources. That was a big part of kind of what we talked about in our group.
Any hints at how it might go? I mean, the resource question to me is the one I lie awake and think about at night.
To prioritize the data outcomes at the beginning, where do you want them to go? And what do you want to create at the end to serve all your partners, as well as making sure resources are, again, going to outreach and communication and making what you're doing have value to a larger group than you probably initially intend, and having that intentionality at the outset.
Anyone else?
Oh, just real quick. So I think resources could mean some of the things that Simone was talking about. And I'm trying to remember, Tyler, help me to remember the Larisha, I can't remember her last name. She was part of our podcast. She created an organization called STEM Brains because she had a similar experience that you did, your pathway and how she went through and how she had, you know, scholarships and internships at NOAA, and then got into it and just was not feeling that there was that same support. There was that support as a student with getting her there, but once she got into the community, there was not that same level of support and mentorship. And so I'll have to remember her last name, but the group that she created was STEM Brains, and it was really about the resource of supporting young people, underrepresented groups, diverse groups, to find their pathway, and not just during school, but when they actually get into their careers, continue to provide that support. So we continue to be a welcoming.
Old white guys need mentoring too. I don't think mentoring ever stops. I mean, I think we should see it as a continuing, it's part of welcoming. You know, I think this notion that I mean, young people need it, sure, but I've been mentored by young people sometimes who remind me of the things that I'm not doing well. And I think that that's a really important thing to remember. We can all be mentored and we should all be open to it. Anybody else?
Yeah, we actually spoke a little bit about the barriers to collaboration, and what came up was building a community or outreach plan, and the notion of making sure your group is diverse, and diversity within diversity was a term that we use. So having one Indigenous partner isn't necessarily representative of the entire California coastline was the example that we used. And having one person from a local community isn't necessarily indicative of the representation that you have within the entire community. So making sure that everyone has a chance to be involved. And then we had this kind of sticky touching point. Yes, it's great to have everyone involved, but who do you actually need to get consent and approval and buy-in from? Because it can be hard to reach a unanimous decision. And so how do you balance all of that?
Great.
I think one of the things.
And,
that
excuse
stood
me,
out- yeah.
Allison, any ideas on who that ought to be? I mean, I'm a federal government guy. I do think at some point the federal government could and should continue to take the lead. I think this notion of building communities could still revolve around NOAA, other federal agencies who are wise and have the link to taxpayer dollars. I think we've got to be able to justify what we're doing ultimately to the taxpayer. And if we cannot do that effectively, then we have a big problem. None of the other stakeholders will ever be able to hang together if we haven't got
Agreed.
someone who develops the code of conduct, someone who ensures that the code of conduct is being observed, providing mentoring facilities. You know, there are a lot of pieces of it, but I hope that we all agree. Do we all agree? Maybe we can talk about that. That the federal government can continue to play that.
Yeah, no, we didn't talk about that specifically, but in a previous breakout session, the notion of leadership did come up. And yes, it's great to get all these people together, and we always need to talk and communicate, but at the end of the day, we still do need a leader and someone that's going to facilitate that. And I don't disagree with you that NOAA is in a position to do that.
Great. Anybody else?
No, just looking at the resources, I think if you're looking at allocation of resources, I think it did stand out that that's one of the things, it's kind of a catch-22 because a lot of the stuff that we want to do, it really needs to be done now and not within the 5 years. But where are those resources coming from? But that really goes back and if you look at it, if you're looking at it from a business model, right, that's you market, people will pay a lot of things for something that they consider valuable. So, stuff that I personally wouldn't pay for, but somebody else finds it valuable. And then you have something else that you think is valuable and then people don't pay for it because they don't find value in it. So if we say that we value outreach and education, then it may take from the pot, but it's still gonna have to be necessary. So it's kind of putting, your money where your mouth is. If you say, this is great, we need to do this now, but if you're looking at accountability, and we talked about this in the group, who's accountable? So you have NOAA, you have all these other folks. And then I think in our groups, like we're all accountable, right? We're all accountable for that. We're all accountable in what we do, the practices that we have. Yes, we have the federal government and they should be held accountable too. The leaders in those positions should be held accountable. But if we're like, okay, you do all the work, it's one of those things, right? You do all the work and then I don't have to worry about it because unless you make me do it, I'm not going to do it. But that's, that's the way it works. But if we all hold each other, like, what are you doing? How do you do that? Then I think that will provide the resources in a very limited pool right now. So, to do the things that we need to do. And I think it's Larita Alamasar, because I work with her.
thank you.
Yes, I work with her.
Just to build on that, we talked about the need for resources, not just being funding, but
Yeah.
being people.
Yes.
And sometimes if an organization can't provide funding for data archiving was the example that we were using in our group, maybe they can provide a person that does that for the expedition or for the scientists, or helps direct the data or things like that. So it's not necessarily funding resources, but in some cases it can be extra people to help with the capacity building or the outreach or the data sharing, and that can go a long way too. Yeah.
One other thing I want to call out Roman again, messaging. I think we all have to be really, really honest with ourselves that we're still mostly talking to each other.
Right.
And as much as I did a podcast this morning and I was asked by a couple of really well-meaning, interested, sympathetic people questions that made me think, why? Who cares? Roman was really good at that. Who cares? And some of those are resource people, some of them are a lot of them are policymakers. And we've got to continue to look at ourselves and saying, are we messaging enough? Are we messaging in the right way? We have great data. We have transparency. We have the right people in the room. We talk to each other, but are we messaging well? So it's something I think we all have to think about. Let's open this up for Q&A. Is there anybody out there that would like to ask this august group a question? Come on. It's the last day. There we go. Somebody in the back. Uh-oh, it's a
I
dean.
know, we're all
It's a
like.
dean. Always be careful when a dean asks you a
I
question.
know, it's like I can't see.
Because what you learn with around deans is that there are no right answers. So
Thank you. I was really intrigued by the idea of pulling examples or how to pull threads together and I don't know the right words, follow the lead or implement or initiate as per the intersection of climate, ocean, and space. I was just curious to hear a little bit more about that. I can't remember who brought it up. Someone did.
Well, it was Roman who motivated us all to talk
Yeah.
about it.
Yeah.
But
we should make Roman. We should make Roman do the message.
Yeah.
But it was really interesting. And I'm, we've talked a bit about this in breakout groups because I brought it up, and not that this is the answer and we'll completely answer your question, but I'm remembering in 2002 with the NOAA NASA Link Symposium, which brought the two groups together. I mean, it was a different time, and Craig McLean was really a motivator behind that gathering, behind that symposium. But the goal, as I understood it, was to bring ocean scientists, technologists, and engineers and educators together to cross-pollinate, to talk about technologies, to get synergies. at the time, I don't think the messaging, right, and this tie into climate and all the things that Roman inspired us to talk about, that wasn't really part of it. But perhaps maybe it's time again to bring the groups together, maybe at an MTS Oceans meeting in a special session. But that might be a way to kind of restart that, bring everybody together, maybe with a different focus this time, and try to pull in the two communities of practice, if you will, and talk about synergies and the messaging. So,
Dan, do we have a virtual question? Not a virtual question. Do we have a question from a virtual attendee?
We're still waiting for our virtual attendees to post questions in the chat. So if anybody in person.
Anybody else here in the audience would like to, you can tell your grandkids that you asked a question to this group of people.
Hi, guys. Gonna first say thank you, Sarita. By the way, Daniel Kleinman, Seaworthy Collective, co-lead for Group C. I just wanted to jump off a point Sarita made that I thought was really important, which was the fact that all of us are accountable, not just NOAA, right? I mean, first off, not all of us work with the federal government. So again, accounting for the community here. What I also wanted to jump off of that point was something that happened in our group, which is, we talked about, I heard code of conduct a lot. And in Miami, we had basically a lot of people move from the Bay Area and this movement called the Miami Tech Manifesto, which was our community coming together and saying, this is our values. And I know we talk a lot about accountability and needing action. And so I'm just curious, if any of those kind of opportunities for identifying shared values and things we can hold people accountable to, and maybe Simone, you can mention some of the KPI pieces we brought up too, came up in your groups as well.
Daniel, you can say the KPI pieces. You got the mic. You good.
Fair, fine. Yeah, so basically, right, I mean, a lot of these commitments and words that have really not had any action behind them, right, can actually be quantified. In the startup world, the KPI, key performance indicator, literally determines if you're progressing and get follow-on investment or you're out of business, which theoretically should be a similar metric our government's held to. And so basically, those quantifiable things can be like, for example, demographics of our community represented here actually being reflective of the demographics of the US, right? Or having, X amount of job applications that, actually reach, we had one point, I believe, I forgot your name, but I see over there, brought up where, it was like, we put a job opportunity out there and all the applicants are white males, right? How are we actually ensuring and intentionally ensuring that we're getting representative data of the applicants being representative of our demographics? These are all quantifiable metrics. And so as we think about, accountability and, KPIs is my word for it, there are ways to actually hold people accountable and create structure for that now that is already an existing practice in the startup world.
So we actually talked about accountability in a little higher level, and that was at the funding level. So our conversation centered around if a funder gets a proposal and they ask for an outreach plan and people write whatever they're going to do, how do you ensure that that's done, that plan took into account, all the stakeholders, everything that we've talked about over these past 2 days. And yes, it's the responsibility of the funder, but that person reviewing the proposal isn't always an outreach expert or a community builder. And so how do you kind of bring in the right expertise at that level? And then if they are not successful, how do you help them? Or is it just withholding funding that, how does that partnership work when there's people proposing to you that I think truly want to do that work, but maybe they weren't as successful? And is that all on NSF, NOAA, other organizations that receive proposals, or is there another partnership there that's currently missing?
We actually talked about funding, but not in the session that we just had yesterday, in one of the other breakout sessions. And we talked about it on that level. And we also discussed making sure that that groups from marginalized communities, underrepresented communities get a percentage of the funds, and that also that other organizations that are supporting those communities also get those funds, right? And to your point about holding folks accountable, like in the application process, right? And if there's an outreach component, I've seen that done in a few of the education and or resilience RFPs that NOAA has. For example, they have like an environmental literacy and a resilience program, and they want to call out like, are you working with any at risk? And that at risk can mean like the elderly who like maybe it's yeah, right, exactly. They define what it is, and I think that that's also pretty important that that you give the applicants the opportunity to talk about who is their, like truly who is their community, their target audience, and what are they going to do to make sure that they reach that target audience? Because again, like I think I mentioned yesterday or whatever other day when I was up here, like it's not enough to just send the note, like send an email or make an announcement, or that's not enough. And so, right, like Christy was saying, oh, we had a job posting and we only got this one set of people that came, right? So where is that job posting going? Like, is it going to the same place that it typically has gone to? What are the other groups that you can be sending it to? And now there are so many groups and organizations that we didn't necessarily have, like even 3 years ago. After the science community, I think, has really changed when it comes to like affinity spaces. They have really opened up. We see like Black in marine science, right? We see Black women in ecology, evolutionary science, and all of these. There are so many affinity groups that I know what they are. I don't know that everyone knows what they are, but they are there. And I would really, really encourage everyone to spend some time looking them up. Like they have websites. They also have Instagram or Twitter pages, right? Like they have these things. Please look them up because they want the opportunities. They deserve the opportunities. They've earned the opportunities, but they don't get them, right? And so sometimes you have to seek them out, but I guarantee you that when you do, we will start to see a change, right? And that's for funding, that's for jobs, that's for everything.
Jamie, I just wanted to make a comment on that and bring up a point that we talked about too, not in this last breakout session, but a previous one. And to your point, Simone, that goes along the lines of partnerships, right? I mean, I know I can't reach the same groups that you can. So let me work with you so you can give me access. You can provide that pathway to these connections. You can be a convener, a connector. I think back to the proposals, one of the things that we talked about, and I'm going to give David from Fugo credit for this one. We talked about in our second breakout about we talked a lot about making sure, the communicators, the science communicators, the professional marketing firms, all of the stakeholders are involved from the very beginning. And how do you do that? And if we could make that just a best practice within our community. It's just what you do, right? When you're starting a project, you got to bring all these people together and put resources, funding, people, however you define resources to that. But if you don't see it as a best practice, and if it isn't just something that you do, there are mechanisms. I mean, you mentioned NSF, we talked about NOAA. I know Rick back there, we were talking about NSF, Rick Murray, we talked about how NSF, there's a requirement for science proposals to include education and outreach and communications. I mean, that's where the COSI network came from, for those of you who remember COSI. So if something like that, I don't know if it's a requirement now, but it could be in a NOAA proposal, NOEF proposal, and that just gets built in. So even if you're not doing it for the good of doing it, right? And because it's the best practice and it's just what we do, which was what David was advocating for. And I would love to think we could all get there one day. You're going to do it because you have to, because if you want to get the funding, you want to get the money, you've got to write that in.
Yeah, I think the point was a lot of the time though, it's like a scientific expert reviewing those proposals and maybe not like an outreach person. And so where does that come in and how do you hold them accountable for that paragraph or that page of the proposal at the end of the day?
And maybe that gets back to, okay, NSF and NOAA and all the folks that you have the proposal. I mean, I've reviewed panels, proposals, I'm sure we all have. And just to make sure you have those type of experts in there who can, be like Simone and go, all right, I'm calling bluff on this one, or they did great. They found this particular community and it's a great partnership. And I know it'll be a welcoming community too. And
Dan, have we got a question from our vast unwashed out there?
We do. We have a question from Peter Gerges. So Peter, we'd love to have you turn on your camera and your mic and talk directly to the panelists.
Hey, folks. It's nice to see you all. Thank you again for a wonderful panel. The last few comments really caught my attention, and I really personally love this notion of getting different agencies and entities that are part of our community to work together to not just advance the science, but how we engage students, how we engage the broader public, and so on. And many of the suggestions you just had are wonderful. It's in my experience, though, there are often impediments to that kind of engagement. So, for example, there are many ways in which I would love to see NOAA and NSF collaborate more directly, and I know that there have been efforts to do that, and there are mechanisms to do that. But my question is, let's think about the structural impediments to that kind of engagement. In other words, how do we address these structural issues that might might allow NOAA and other agencies to work to alleviate some of these barriers that prevent cross-agency collaborations? Or how, for example, how might we better promote engagement between not just NOAA and NSF, but the Department of Education? Even like housing and urban development, right? I mean, there are so many federal entities, and that doesn't even address the structural impediments of federal agencies working with NGOs and the like. So I do know there are some programs to kind of catalyze this engagement, but I really think we need more because there are so many impediments. So my question to you all as panelists, and frankly, everyone there, is how might we make headway in addressing these sort of structural impediments that inhibit some of the kinds of engagements we are all talking about? Thank you.
Well, we need another forum for that.
Ooh, I know, that's a big heavy question.
We only have a few minutes. Take a shot. It's not an easy question.
I would say the National Oceanographic Partnership Program previously did an excellent job of bringing together the federal agencies that all had ocean mandates, and specifically the Interagency Working Group on Ocean Partnerships. And I would just put a call out for that to be more inclusive. I think that forum could be a great mechanism for also bringing in philanthropy and industry, and some of the examples Pete gave, education and urban development typically were not involved in that group. But I think while it existed, it did do a pretty good job of bringing together the federal agencies, and I think it should just be expanded to be more impactful.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent suggestion. Anybody else?
Maybe, I was going to say, I'm just trying to think of, because usually, and y'all can correct me if I'm wrong, is if you're looking at that, to me, it seems very high level. So if you're bringing those individuals together, maybe bring individuals as advisors. I'm not saying me, but as an advisor, it's like, okay, this is what we're doing. This is what I'm hearing. Okay. Because those high officials too may not understand the needs. So they have the power and the authority to change policy, to implement things, but they don't necessarily have that wisdom that you can get from someone else. And so if those individuals are open to that, I know I had somebody come up to me yesterday and said that is very committed to that, but at the same time, it's like, does commitment to that change? It's going to look a little different, because if we're going to have the same people meeting again, and I think the same thing's going to come out. So, but having that advisory, have some impact to those advisors or whoever it is that you get your information from, because I understand at that high level, it's hard for you to know everything. Because it's kind of like being out of the classroom, right? You go into administration, you forget what it's like to be in a classroom with 30 kids, and you want them to do all these things in administration, and they just don't get it. And it's not that they can't, it's just that they've been out of the system for a while, right? So who do you ask when you need regulations on education? You ask the educators, not you, because you're not going to know what to do. The people that are in the trenches will give you a different perspective. And if you're willing to listen to that, then maybe that could because we need change. I mean, it's going to go both ways, right? From the bottom up and from the top down. And so whoever holds that power to do that needs to realize that that power needs to be distributed to what voices are heard. I don't know if that makes sense. So.
I mean, Rachel Medley's here from NOAA OER. Rachel's been helping implement the national strategy for mapping, exploration, and characterization. And a big first phase of that has been reaching out to, I think, Rachel, 17 federal agencies. So I do think the aspiration, at least, is of the Presidential Commission over two decades ago was multi-agency support for this activity. I think the aspiration is that that will happen again. Doesn't mean the barriers aren't there. Pete's right. It's really going to be complicated, but there is an aspiration to do it. And I think the time is right to again ask the question.
And just to clarify, if you're in that federal mindset, like if I was a federal employee and I worked, that's you begin to have your own kind of tunnel vision. You bring somebody from the outside and they tell you something like, well, we can't do that. My question would be like, why? Like, this is what's needed. Why can't we do that? And sometimes they can answer the question, and sometimes like, oh, I don't know, it's been done like this for a long time. So what do we need to do to change that? So, you know, bringing those perspectives, it gives you a different way to think of things, because it's not like, you know, against anybody, but if you're looking at something a certain way, you get used to it. And somebody comes in and it's like, okay, I mean, a great example is like Maud and Maggie. It's like, oh, they tell me stuff like, oh, I never thought of it that way, because I'm doing kind of my own thing. And then they come in and it's like, let's do this and that. And if they ask me something, I was like, I don't know, you know, students have asked me that too. Why can't we do that? Well, I don't know.
Well, Jamie, real quick, I mean, I think
We're just about out of time.
underlying theme here, people, relationships, bringing in all the stakeholders. I mean, just in summary, a big job, but I think you touched upon it, right? Bringing people in, making sure everybody who might have a say in it and have a perspective that's different, and about, you know, bringing people together and building a relationship and having those conversations.
You know, Ballard put telepresence out there as a way of getting ocean exploration to the public. Think of how different this forum would be if we were in telepresence mode. Not just with a virtual list of attendees, but anybody who could tune in. How would our messaging be different if the public were looking in at us? And on that note, I'm going to call for a break.